Okay, members, well, it's 12:30, so start of today's meeting. I have got some script to read to you all, but I think first of all I'll deviate from the script just to welcome us all here together on this most auspicious day. I'm sure I can speak on behalf of my comrades and myself about celebrating a certain event that's taking place this evening. Well, I thought I'd mention it though. There's a paper if everybody wants it afterwards, okay? Yeah. No, okay. Anyway, okay, good afternoon everybody, welcome to Scrutiny Management Panel. I'm Councillor Jason Fazackley, Chair of the panel. I need to draw your attention to some of the following housekeeping and safety items of information. If a continuous fire alarm sounds, please evacuate the room and the public gallery by the stairwells. Do not attempt to use any lifts and please assemble at Queen Victoria's statue in front of the civic offices. In order to comply with fire regulations, if you signed into the Guildhall, please remember to sign out when you leave the building after today's meeting. Live web streaming, may I draw everyone's attention to the fact this meeting will be live streamed from a camera at a fixed location at the back of the meeting room, and the recording will be available on the Council's website. The camera will mainly capture the backs of anyone making deputations, but actually we have none, and there will be some footage of them as they approach and leave the table. Microphones are located and people entering or leaving the room while the meeting is in progress, but none of that's going to take any effect because we've got no deputations. Members of the public are also permitted to record the meeting on the understanding it neither disrupts the meeting nor records those stating explicitly they do not wish to be recorded. Again, we have no members of the public, just a member of the press. Can I ask everyone to use the microphones provided when they're speaking, and please can I ask members and officers to introduce themselves, starting to my left, which is... You're not to my left, you should be to my right. Okay, sorry. Right. I looked at you because naturally you're an old lefty.
I'm generally to the... I have to admit I'm generally to the right of you, Councillor Fazackley. Councillor Peter Harris, Hilsey Ward. I don't know, we've already lost the room.
Chris Ward, Director of Finance.
Councillor George Fielding, Central South Sea Ward.
Vicky Pleathouse, Democratic Services.
Joe Hooper, Paulsgrove Ward.
Councillor Simon Bosher, Drayton and Farlington.
Ben Dowling, Councillor for Milton Ward.
Now, Leo Madden, Councillor Nelson Ward, sitting to the right of, but not right of, Jason Fazackley.
Thank you, that's Councillor Jason Fazackley. I'm sorry. Okay, apologies for absence. We have received one apology from Councillor Benedict Swan. No apologies from Councillor Will Purvis, I don't know where he is. There are no deputations for today's meeting, so it then moves us on to minutes of the meeting held on the 18th of September 2019, page 3 of the papers that we've been given today. Members, are there any problems with any of the pages? I'll go through them quickly. Page 3, page 4, and my signature on page 5. Okay,
Chair, can I just ask you to do declarations of members' interest, if there are any, please?
Okay, thank you for the reminder. It's not on my script that I was given, that I was told was totally reliable. Okay. Right, okay, no problem with the minutes then of the last meeting. Can I have a proposer for those?
Agreed.
Okay, seconded? Yep, okay, all in favour? Yep, fine, thank you, they're agreed. Okay, can I now ask for declarations of members' interests? Anybody got any?
I've got no interest in anything.
No, okay, there are no interests.
No, you're asking for them, not asking for none.
I'm asking for any... Do you want to chair this?
You got no reply.
Yeah, so there are no declarations of interest. Thank you for clarity, Councillor Madden. I think it might be him.
Yeah, okay, I don't think a meeting like this makes any bloody difference.
Okay.
We'll quote you on that.
It's a very important meeting. Okay, thank you. We are now on to the last item on the agenda, which is item 4, presentation of Portsmouth City Council's budget and council tax for 2021. Sorry. As you can see, a presentation will be given by Chris Ward, Section 151 officer. Members have the opportunity to ask any questions at that point. So, Chris, can I ask you to go ahead with your presentation? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So as you know, the purpose of this is to for you to have an opportunity to scrutinise the budget. It's also an opportunity for you to make any either recommendations or representations to Cabinet when they consider the budget report on the 4th of February, I believe. So, usual structure from me, I will take you through, once this starts working, right, I'll take you through a little bit of where we are at the moment, so where we are as a council and what the overall financial position of the council looks like and where we've come from. Then move into what does the revised budget look like, so the budget that was set in February, any revisions to that. Then move into what is the proposals of the administration for next year's budget, spending proposals, council tax proposals and savings proposals. Then we'll take a look into the future and have an assessment of what we think the future position looks like, so the 3 years beyond next year, and what the overall financial position looks like for the council there and what that means for future savings requirements. Then touch on the capital programme, which is obviously also a consideration for you and for the council, and then we can pick up I'll do a summary and pick up any questions at the end. So, like I said, so let's start with a little bit of history. If we go back in time, back to 2011-12, when the austerity period came in, so obviously as a consequence of the financial crash. Since that period, if we look at that period and right up until to date, where we are in the current year, the council has had to accommodate £126 million worth of cost pressures or funding reductions. So that's on the left-hand side of the scale. And the left-hand side of the scale attempts to demonstrate those things that have gone against the council in financial terms, or financial challenges that the council has had to meet. And on the right-hand side of the scale is how the council has balanced it up. Because, as you know, the obligation on the council is each and every year to set a balanced budget. So you'll see the dominant force behind over that period has been the £83 million worth of funding reductions, and this is common across all local authorities, and the figure that's often quoted is it's been around about, it's probably getting up to over 40% of council's controllable spend has now been reduced since the period that since where we were in 2011-12. £26 million worth of inflation, everybody experiences inflation, and £17 million worth of budget pressures, and they're largely dominated by the essential care services, so adults and children's social care, so it's generally budget additions to accommodate increases in demand, demographic pressures, and some extraordinary inflationary pressures actually, but that tends to be driven, and you'll see it come through the rest of the presentation, by the higher than general inflation increases as a consequence of the national living wage. So on the positive financial side is that the council, in response to that, has made over £100 million worth of savings and efficiencies over the whole period, and the council has raised council tax by 24 million. So it just paints a picture of the scale of the challenge that's happened over the previous years. And obviously you'll know from the budget papers and from the council resolution last year that the saving requirement for the coming year is a further £2.5 million, and clearly that will take the savings and efficiencies of the council up from the 1.2 million up to around the £105 million mark. So as you would expect, the council has developed an overall strategy and an overall aim about how it might meet the challenge that it's faced, and how it might do that with some focus on protecting council services and some focus on regeneration or improving the economic prosperity of the city in order to manage the impact on residents as best that it can. This will be familiar to you, because not least because I write it in every budget report, but also because it's the council's overall financial strategy. I won't dwell on it too much, but you'll be familiar that the council's got 4 strands. Obviously some of it is about innovation, some of it is about how the council tries to improve prosperity across the city. That obviously has the impact of reducing the demand for council services. Some of it is about value for money, and some of it is about when you've exhausted all of those other three strands, which is generally the strategy, that you're then into service reductions. But you exhaust everything else that you can before you find yourself in a position of having to balance up through service reductions. Part of the challenge with a strategy like this is each of those strands have different lead times, so there will inevitably be, in any year, a degree of service reductions to make whilst you're waiting for your other strands to come through. So just to finish up with where we are right now and how we reported the overall, if you like, medium-term position of the council last February, we're working towards a overall deficit over the period of this coming financial year and the following 2 years of 7.5 million. And the council resolved last year that we should approach that in a phased way, equalise the 7.5 million over 3 years at £2.5 million worth of savings each year. So £2.5 million worth of savings this coming year, a further 2.5 the year after, and a further 2.5 the year after. The council report of last February that also provided this forecast said that there's a great deal of uncertainty on the horizon in terms of local government funding as well, and those forecasts could vary by plus or minus 3 million. So that's the position that we start from. So if we move into the current year now, and the current year that we're in, obviously when the budget was set in February, a number of things, circumstances have changed, things have happened, and the council needs to respond to anything that's happened over that period. So the proposals in the budget report are now to revise the budget to just short of 100, net budget that is, just short of 166 million. So within the year, the council is experiencing an overspend on Portico of 1.8 million. Now that's primarily driven by two factors. One is the unexpected, actually, and unfortunate announcement that Fifes are leaving Portico. And that's really to do with the fact that from next year they want to use, or that their partner, Maersk, want to use larger ships with deeper drafts that cannot be accommodated by Portico. It's not anything to do with service delivery or customer service, it's all about the size of the ships. And it's a commercial decision that they've taken. And also the ending of what's called the Moroccan contract, which was a fruit contract. However, if you roll that forward into next year, what we have got is the return of Geest, if you remember. And Geest were the largest customer of Portico a couple of years ago before they moved to Dover. They're returning to Portsmouth, and it's a significant contract. And so the forecast position for Portico in next financial year is a relatively small £0.3 million loss. In overall financial terms, that is a benefit to the council. It sounds odd, but there are other income streams elsewhere in the council that the council derive, particularly in the port, as a consequence of the trade that takes place at Portico. So in the current year, there's the need to accommodate a £1.8 million overspend as a consequence of that. There are underspends in other areas in the council's treasury management activities. Council's had additional funding as well. Some of it is Brexit related, some of it is other smaller grants. And in the way that the revised budget is framed, it suggests a reduction of 0.4 million to the council's corporate contingency in order to balance the whole budget back up. But even by taking out that 0.4 million pound from the council's contingency, it will be able to accommodate the forecast overspendings in the current year for adults and children's social care, and the quite actually sizable increase in the costs of home to school transport that the council's experiencing, largely because of the general increase in numbers of children with special educational needs that under the council's policy have an entitlement to transport to their school. And there's additional costs associated with IT as well, which are the costs that we'll incur on licenses before we end up with a cloud-based solution for most of the council's software. So in overall terms, that brings the budget into balance, so there's no significant change to the overall size of the budget that was agreed February last year to what's being proposed now. So that deals with the current year. If we now start to look forward to next year, first thing that's happened is this time of year, or December time, we always receive what's called the local government finance settlement. So the local government finance settlement is broadly the government funding that the council will receive next year. In overall terms, the funding is expected, well, it will be about £3 million more than it was in the current year. Now, the main reason for that is a grant that's called the Social Care Grant. Now, that social care grant can be used either for children's social care or for adult social care. The government have provided it in recognition that they know that there are serious financial challenges around the country in those two service areas. And it was nationally, the figure is £1 billion. So it's £1 billion that government have provided across all local authorities for next financial year. We've had a reduction in our new homes bonus, a much smaller amount, a 0.4 million. On top of that, there's been some other announcements that really relate to the continuation of funding, but this time last year, government hadn't announced that that funding would continue, so it was always at risk and something that we were having to accommodate within the council's financial forecast. So they've announced the continuation of the winter pressures funding, which is the support that we get to help enable hospital discharges and so forth during this time of the year. The continuation of what's called the Improve Better Care, that's kind of embedded into social care expenditure. And the other announcement, which isn't necessarily a surprise, but it's the cessation of the business rate retention pilot that this council was in a pooled arrangement with the Isle of Wight Council and Southampton City Council. I'll talk more about that on the next slide. It doesn't affect our forecasts because we've never relied on a continuation of it going forward, but it does deny the council a source of funding that it was receiving in this year and previous years. But more on that in the next slide. The other part of the settlement is that the government announced what we call them council tax limits, referendum thresholds, but the amount by which the council can increase the level of council tax by. They set that at 2%. For general purposes, it's 2%. Broadly inflation-based, and if you look back at the kind of the indices that government were using at the time, they're probably looking at CPI in September last year, and CPI was running at 1.63% at that point. So it's a broadly inflation-based uplift in council tax that's allowed. They're also offering the flexibility to tax for a further 2% on top of that for the adult social care precept. That means if you tax for it, and it does amount to about 1.6 million, that funding has to be passported directly to adult social care. Recently, not as part of the settlement actually, but I think about a week or so ago, government announced that they would allow up to a £10 increase for the Police and Crime Commissioner. In percentage terms for us, that'll be a 4.96% increase on on their current precept. And the Fire and Rescue Authority, they have a similar threshold to local authorities at 2%. I'll bring that together in a later slide to see what does that actually, if all of those things went through, what would it look like to the total bill of a Portsmouth City Council resident. The other key announcements in the settlement really were that you will know that we had a spending round, I think it was last September, and government have basically just rolled on funding. So we haven't had what's called a comprehensive multi-year comprehensive spending review. That is now due to take place in this year. So that will set the overall envelope for the public sector as a whole, and it should give government departmental allocations and therefore indications to us in local government about the funding that will be available for the next, what we hope will at least be the next 3 years. At the moment, we don't know. So when I come to the next part of the presentation and I start to talk to you about the council's forecast going forward, it's based on us looking at a crystal ball with a whole load of uncertainty, which I'll come to later. The government had originally intended to implement this thing called the Fair Funding Review for this coming financial year. Now that is basically saying the black box and the formula that we have at the moment that distributes funding to each and every council, we're going to have a look at that to make sure that it's still representative of the relative need of all of those different councils. So as a consequence of that, there will inevitably be winners and losers. Make the assumption that the overall quantum that's going to be distributed is the same, but it will just be distributed differently. And we don't know the outcome of that, and the government delayed the implementation of it as well. So it was due to be implemented this coming year, it's been delayed a year, and it's now due to be implemented the following financial year. That is going to come accompanied by a review of the business rate retention scheme. Now the business rate retention scheme basically says that for all business rates raised, you get to keep a proportion of it. The national scheme at the moment is you get to keep 50%. If you're familiar with last year's budget report and the year before that budget report, we're in a pilot scheme with those two other authorities I mentioned earlier, Southampton and the Isle of Wight, to retain currently 75% of all business rates growth. And that's had a significant financial benefit across the region, which I'll come to. But the big part of that review is the fact that nationally, the growth in business rates over the period that that scheme has been in place, which has been kept by local authorities, is over £2 billion. And that £2 billion, the Portsmouth proportion of that £2 billion is 5.6 million. So there's 5.6 million pounds worth of business rate growth that the council is currently enjoying. It's obviously being used and spent on delivery of services, and some of those key services will be adults and children's and waste and all of the other services of the council. There will be this thing called a reset, so they're going to take that growth away. But it's not going to be denied from the local government system as a whole, and it will be redistributed, but it will be redistributed as part of this fair funding review, so it will be redistributed based on need. So the council will find itself in a position where the local authority that's generated the business rate growth will have it taken away, but it will be redistributed nationally based on where the greatest need is for service delivery. And that's based on a whole raft of indices, data, and so forth. What we don't know is whether we'll get 5.6 million back, whether we'll get more than 5.6 million back, or whether we'll get less than 5.6 million back. So it's a big uncertainty for our forecasts going forward. So let me just touch on this business rate retention pilot. Like I said, it's now been ceased alongside almost every other business rate pilot that was going on in the country. But over the period, and it will have been I can't remember now if it's a 2-year, 3-year period. I think it's over the period of the business rate retention scheme, and I can't remember now if it's 2 or 3 years. But to the region, so the 3 authorities, there was £22 million worth of growth that we benefited from that we otherwise wouldn't have benefited from had we not been in the pilot arrangement and in the pooled arrangement. And you can see, roughly speaking, that 22 million is 9 million to Southampton, 8 million to Portsmouth, and 5 million to the Isle of Wight. The reason it's a big number is when you measure the business rate growth, you measure it from 13-14 to date, and actually you get to keep what would have otherwise been kept by government, because we moved from a 50% scheme in the first year to 100%, then in the second year to a 75% scheme. So we got to retain all the government's share of business rate growth as well as our own share. The council had never relied on it in terms of its day-to-day revenue spending, so had never factored it into its revenue budget, but had always put any gains from that scheme to support its capital programme, which is spend of a one-off nature. So therefore, in the event that it came to an end, which it was only ever guaranteed on a year-by-year basis, in the event that it came to an end, that we hadn't relied on it in terms of our revenue budget going forward, but it does deny the council the opportunity of funding for its capital programme. So within the budget paper that's put forward by the administration, there's obviously a council tax proposal in there. But firstly, by way of context, you're probably aware that Portsmouth actually has a low level of council tax. So the council tax amount is low compared to our statistical neighbours. And it's about 10% lower. The average council tax in Portsmouth is a band B. Everybody, when they talk about council tax, when government talk about council tax, they talk about band D, because that's the national average, but the average in Portsmouth is band B. And in Portsmouth, about 52% of all residents pay the full amount of council tax. The other 48% will be receiving some form of exemption or discount, either an exemption because they're a student or they're a single person, or 25% discount because they're a single person, or they might be receiving some level of council tax support. So just over 50%, or just over half of residents pay the full amount. The proposal for next year is to increase the council tax for general purposes, setting aside the adult social care issue for a minute, of 1.99%. That will raise £1.6 million, and it equates to 42 pence per week for our average taxpayer. There's also a proposal to increase the council tax by a further 2%, and again raising 1.6 million, and for that to be passported directly to adult social care. And you heard me on a previous slide say adult social care in the current year is experiencing financial stress. It's overspending its budget at the moment for a number of reasons, and it's actually crucial that there is additional funding for adult social care if we're going to stabilise their budget and therefore stabilise their services going forward. On top of that, the other part of the council tax amount council tax income that we receive during the year is if there's been any additions or reductions in the number of, if you like, council tax payers. We call it the council tax base, and that has risen as well by the equivalent of just under 660 band D taxpayers, which generates around about £1 million. So more taxpayers in the city next year. If we pull all of that together, now obviously none of these tax changes are confirmed at this stage, but let's assume that the council were to agree to 3.99%, being the 1.99 and the 2% for adult social care, that the Police and Crime Commissioner were going to increase their precept by £10, which equates to 4.96%, and the Fire Authority do 1.99, it will result in just over a 4% increase in council tax to the Portsmouth resident. If we move on to, so they're the council tax proposals within the budget report that's been published. If we move on to, and how does the administration propose to find the £2.5 million worth of savings that council resolved last February would need to be achieved? In headline terms, just over 50% of that is additional income. Just under 50% of that is efficiency savings, and within the proposals, I think it's just £30,000 worth of savings proposals that really are a genuine service reduction. If we move that on and drill into, well, where are those savings being found? Well, there's no savings proposals put forward either for the children and families portfolio. They have as I've described earlier, they've got a underlying budget deficit, so it wouldn't have been a responsible thing to do to then ask a service that's in serious deficit to start to make savings as well. And similarly, the community safety portfolio is not being asked for savings, largely because of the impact that community safety can have on the children and families portfolio in terms of the support that they provide to avoid, if you like, children being taken into care. The largest contributors to the savings are the leader portfolio, which is where all of the property assets are and the property generating income assets are, and the resources portfolio. Together they make up almost just over half of the savings that are proposed. And if we go to the other end of the spectrum and say identify where the smaller contributors are in percentage terms, that's in culture and city development and in education. So you'll see in the budget report, and also you will have heard throughout the year that the council has been forecasting an overspend in the current year, and it's mainly driven by the underlying deficits that we've got in adults and children's social care. There's an obligation on us to remedy that and ensure that we've got a robust budget position when we start the next financial year. So there's a proposal in the budget report to increase the funding to children's and families by £3 million. You may recall that the council elected to increase funding for children and families last year, or in the current year, by £4 million. So it's over 2 years, it's a £7 million increase. And if anybody here has got the recall, you'll probably remember that a couple of years ago, children and families overspent their budget by about the same sum. So they're broadly on a flat line in terms of their financial position with that additional £3 million. And health, wellbeing and social care, mainly adult social care to be fair, there's a recommendation to increase their funding by 2.6 million. Now 1.6 million is the precept, so the passport and the precept, and a further £1 million on top of that, again to address their underlying deficits, which I've described in the next two sections on this slide. And you heard me mention earlier on that we've got an overspend in home to school transport. So there's a proposal also in the budget report for next year to increase the budget for education by 360,000 I think it is, or 0.4 million for education in order to accommodate that actual sustained rise in the numbers of children with special educational needs that need transport to their schools. I've set out on the slides the rationale for the increases for both adults and children's social care, but I won't dwell on the detail. So if we try and summarise what's happening, or the key features, if you like, of the budget proposal for next year is, it's a budget of just over 174.6 million. We've added inflation for all services, so that basically means that you get steady state services. So the cost of inflation across the council is estimated at 4.1 million. As I've mentioned, we've increased the budget proposed budget proposal for children's social care of 3 million, adult social care 2.6 million. There's a big revenue contribution to capital. Now that's funding the capital proposals that are before you that we'll talk to later, of 16 million. A big chunk of that's coming from the MTRS reserve, and the rest of it's a genuine revenue contribution in the year. Some of it was pre-planned. Contingency set at just over 10 million, and you'll have seen from the previous slide on the revised budget that the only way we've been able to contain a balanced budget for the current year is by using the contingency to meet those pressures that we've experienced in both adults and children's social care. There's a proposed transfer to the medium-term resource strategy reserve of 3.5 million. That's because largely because in the capital report proposals, there's a drawdown on the MTRS reserve of 6 million to support the capital programme. So it's about trying to replenish it to a level where it can continue to be a vehicle for the council's spend to save and invest to save schemes. And of course, there's the proposed savings of 2.5 million. That deals with this kind of the spending side of the proposed budget for next year. The funding side, I've talked about this earlier. Like I said, additional funding from government 3 million, additional council tax if you add it all up of about 4.1 if there's a 3.99% increase in the tax. We've actually experienced a reduction in retained business rates, or our expectation is a reduction in retained business rates, mainly on retail, going into next year, so that's something that the council suffers. And then there's this thing called the collection fund, which is basically where we accumulate all of the income from council tax and business rates. And if our estimates, when we set the budget, aren't quite right, we either have a surplus or a deficit, and then it's distributed the following year. So we're currently estimating a surplus on the fund, so we bring that one-off surplus back into the funding position for the council the following year. Key things, I think, in terms of the sustainability of that as a budget, not just for next year but for going forward, are that the social care grant that I mentioned earlier on, which is the driver of this extra £3 million that the council has received in funding next year. In total, that grant is now 5.4 million because it was introduced for the first time this year and it's being continued next year. There's mention of it in the Conservative manifesto that it will remain for the life of the Parliament. But there's no mention that it's real additional money to the local government system as a whole. And there are some advisors that are suggesting that in the absence of an announcement, what we could find is, do you remember I mentioned right up front that there's this national growth in business rates and we're going to lose 5.6 million, it's going to be redistributed. There are some suggestions that it could effectively be top sliced from that and therefore not be additional money to the local government system, and therefore in a roundabout way we will have some of it removed from local authorities. So we don't know that. It's quite a risk for our future financial forecasts. I've talked about the risk associated with the business rate reset, and also we always carry the risks of the genuinely increasing demands on both adults and children's social care. I think on top of that actually is that there are, in coming to those, our central assumption is in terms of the stabilised positions for the budgets of adult social care for next year, there are still, each of those services both have their own, what we describe as financial sustainability plans. So they have got savings proposals even built within those. So they will remain a risk. They will remain a risk for the council as well. Is the deliverability of those savings. Some of them are predicated in children's, for example, on reductions in the number of looked after children, and some of them on adult social care are predicated on changing the way that the service is delivered for a more independent service, which reduces the reliance on either longer term residential or nursing care, which is the most expensive form of care that the council provides for. So they're the key proposals for the budget for next financial year. If we start to say, what does the future look like, because we also need to start to think about planning for the future. You'll recall the last forecast that I did and brought to the council said, we think we're going to have a £7.5 million deficit over the next 3 years. Well, one of those years has now passed, because that's the coming year that we're just about to enter into, and you'll have delivered, hopefully, £2.5 million worth of savings of that overall forecast. We prepare a rolling 3-year forecast, so that year has now ineffectively fallen out of the forecast, and we add a new year to the forecast, and we revise all of the assumptions within that forecast based on the information that we have available to us. So old forecast said 7.5 million. New forecast says we think that deficit has fallen. It's now 3 million, but we're comparing 2 different time periods. But across those 2 forecasts, there are 2 common years, obviously the middle 2 common years. So our revised forecast is now for 3 million. Our central expectations are that we'll still have funding reductions from government, but that's mainly to do with this thing that I said earlier about the business rate reset and the loss of business rate growth, because we don't know how much of that will come back. We also don't know if there'll be the continuation of I keep calling it Children's Social Care Grant, of the social care grant, which for the council also amounts to over £5 million. Our forecast for inflation and pensions over the period is 16 million addition. We're anticipating some other budget pressures, mainly around the demographics for children's and adults, that might amount to around about 6.5 million as well. On the plus side, in terms of those things that are financially positive for the council, well, there's £10 million worth of revenue contributions in the current budget. That's not forecast to remain in place for the budget in 3 years' time, so they're removed. We are assuming those savings will be delivered in both adults and children's social care that are embedded in their financial sustainability plans, and they've got strategies wrapped around that. Together they amount to 4.7 million. Council tax increases for the council, assumed at 1.99% for the next 3 years, would raise 4.6 million, and just inflation on business rates, which rises with CPI each year, we're assuming will generate 3.8 million. If you add all of those things up, it gives us an overall deficit over the period of 3 million. So what that basically means is, compared to next year, 3 years later, the council, if all of our assumptions are right, of course, the council needs to be spending £3 million less then than it is next year. But proposal, warning signal actually, that because of all of those uncertainties, that we could be out by plus or minus 4 million. So there is therefore kind of strategy, if you like, sat behind how do you then try to plan for such an uncertain position, but we need to have a central forecast. So our central forecast is the 3 million, and again we suggest that that should be equally phased over the next 3 years, in part because if our forecasts are wrong, if we've got it wrong and the deficit is higher, we've made a reasonable contribution to the deficit. If we've got it wrong and the deficit's lower, we also haven't gone too far towards what will be a lower position in the future years. So it's proposed as a balanced approach to achieving a £3 million saving over that period. If we move away from the revenue budget onto the capital programme, Council has got a capital strategy, and obviously the capital investment proposals that are put before the Council do sit nicely within that strategy. So there's stuff in the strategy about maintaining operational services, particularly your statutory services. There's the strategy also, there's environmental impacts, environmental aspects of the strategy. There's also parts of the strategy that's really targeted towards regeneration of the city, and you'll have heard me talk about that in the overall financial strategy as well earlier on, and parts of the strategy about income generation as a means to avoid cuts to services and invest to save. In terms of the council resources that are proposed to be proposed to fund the capital investment, there's just over 13 million of what we call corporate capital resources. So that's a mixture of things that we almost put into this thing that you may have heard before, what we might describe as a single capital pot. So it's income that we get from community infrastructure levy, it's the money that we get from non-ring-fence capital grants that there aren't many of, to be fair, and it's also any capital receipts that we might have, which again there aren't many of. But it's also any revenue contributions, and you heard me say earlier on in the presentation that there's a big revenue contribution to capital in the current year, and that's forming part of that £13 million. On top, I'm going to skip to the bottom and come back to the middle. On top of that, there's £6.2 million of earmarked reserves available, mainly from the MTRS reserve, because a number of the capital proposals satisfy its criteria for spend to save or spend to avoid cost. And then in addition to that, there's there's £33.6 million worth of borrowing proposed, and again for schemes that are going to generate or likely to generate income sufficient to be able to cover the debt costs associated with taking on that borrowing. Total capital investment is actually more than the 53 million. Is 69, because there's some of that money actually then levers in other external contributions. So total scheme value of that capital investment by the council is 69 million because it brings in funding from elsewhere. So if we have a go at categorising the capital investment proposals that are put forward into those kind of broad themes that are set out in the strategy, you'll see that there's significant amount of money for what we might describe as statutory responsibilities or operational effectiveness, significant money for school places, mainly special educational needs places where there's a kind of an immediate demand and an immediate need to respond both this September and the following September for places. There's significant money for just maintaining the council's operational estate from which services are provided. Money for new council housing, there's money for IT, both in terms of the infrastructure itself and the software that sits on it. There's a significant proposal for the build of a new anaerobic digestion plant. Or a number of these proposals are subject to business case. So this is getting approval in principle, subject to business case for a number of those things, particularly all of those things that are subject to funding by borrowing, because council needs to know that it can comply with what's called the Prudential Code, i.e. any borrowing that you undertake is affordable and you can demonstrate that you can make the repayments on it. So some of these are at early-ish stages, but they're being put forward to council for agreement in principle, and subject to being viable, financially sustainable, then they would be approved. I don't think I'll go too much into some of the others. It's quite an extensive capital programme across quite a broad range of kind of policy initiatives. Whilst the capital investment proposals are substantial, I think when you start to look at the future and think about what both the council's obligations going forward and its aspirations as well, and you start to value or put a price on how much that type of investment might cost, it's really quite substantial, and it's way in excess of the amount of funding that the council ordinarily receives on an annual basis for capital, which is probably about £7 million, unless the council is going to supplement it from its revenue budget or other sources. But £7 million worth of, usually it's a little bit of money from the department for transport, but they do have an expectation that you'll spend it on transport. A little bit of money from the department for education. They do expect you to passport that on for school maintenance. Apart from that, we get some disabled facilities grants money. That has to be agreed in consultation with the CCG, and it usually goes on, it has to be spent either on disabled facilities or on adult social care more generally, and a bit of community infrastructure levy, and that's pretty much it. It's about 7 million a year. So the fact that the council's put 13 million in the current year, as well as drawn on other reserves to get to overall resources of 53 million this year, is quite significant compared to what you would ordinarily expect to be available in a single year. So I call that, in my mind, I call that the capital gap. And how are we going to address the capital gap in our plans going forward, particularly when you look at some of those kind of needs which are actually really quite important, especially around school places. So so that's just the head scratcher really. If I just try and summarise, I don't think I'm going to summarise too much on the revenue budget, because I think I've almost done that as I've gone through. I think the main things to point out really is that the budget put forward next year is pretty robust. It's done a lot to address the underlying deficits where we've historically had underlying deficits in children's and adult social care. It's the future that is more difficult, I think. We've got a really uncertain future for local government funding, and our forecasts going forward could be quite different than the 3 million. But if we turn to the capital programme, that is quite a challenge as well, because we've got significant capital obligations going forward and really constrained capital resources. And I think there's two things that the council are going to have to consider seriously going forward, and that is the extent to which it puts its own revenue budget into capital, and also it's the extent to which it can bid for funds from central government for some of the schemes that it would like to pursue. Usually, if you want to bid for funds, you've got to have a worked up business case, and some of those business cases, as you'll see actually in this capital programme, are quite costly to prepare, but you have to be ready, and government tend to allocate money for oven-ready schemes. I think that's all I wanted to say, and I'll pass back to you, Chair, to handle any questions.
Thank you, Chris, in particular for a very comprehensive presentation. Thank you for going through that so clearly. Members, now's the opportunity to ask any questions if you have any. If I have an indication you'd like to speak, one to Councillor Bosher first of all.
Thank you, Chairman. I've got a few questions, if I can. If I just for information, just going backwards through the slides, Chris, for capital investment obligations and aspirations. Halfway down that slide, you've got the hard cathodic protection. Is that something that is happening now, or is that come under aspiration?
There's in the currently approved capital programme.
From last...
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's already in.
Yeah.
There's a provision of 1.3 million.
Yeah.
And 1.3 million will do a good proportion of the cathodic protection that's required under the HART.
But it's not happened. It's not happened yet.
It hasn't happened yet, no.
Right. Okay.
But there is provision for it, and it's sufficient to do some, but not all, of the cathodic protection that can be done.
Do you know the reason why it hasn't started yet? Or is that more Martin?
It is with Martin.
Yeah.
And I think partly it's been to do with how will the actual design of it work, but I don't know the details.
Okay, I'll speak to Martin. I'm just concerned that 2 years ago the current leader made comments about the hard falling into the sea and why it wasn't done under the previous administration. Here we are 2 years later and nothing's actually happened, so I'd be curious to find that one out, but I'll speak to Martin Labers on that one. If I can, Chair, back to your, what is effectively your second page slide, overall impact of austerity. And if you look at it in conjunction with your medium-term financial strategy, your 4 strands, being a bit complicated, I apologise. The 2 green boxes that you've got are council tax 24 million and savings and efficiencies 102 million. Savings and efficiencies, for layman's speak, are effectively changing the way we do things or making cuts, if I'm being blunt. Where do things like sponsorship of the Spinnaker Tower fall into that? Do you put that under the savings and efficiencies box, or because it's not under council tax, is it?
No, it's under savings and efficiencies.
Comes under savings and efficiencies. So
that bit that says savings and efficiencies, if you look back over every budget report that we've done, and you know the appendix that says these are all the savings and efficiencies,
Yeah.
if you added every single one of those up, you would get to that number.
right, and that would fall into that, because that sponsorship is due to run out shortly, isn't it? So that money would have to be found to be replaced from somewhere, I guess, would it? Where has that been factored into where we're talking about?
We are assuming in the budget proposal going forward that there will be continuing sponsorship funding at a broadly similar level. I'm not saying where from, but our assumption is that it will be at a broadly similar amount. So it's not a...
Sorry, words like broadly assuming and assumption don't exactly fill me with confidence, to be quite honest, because we could end up with a funding black hole if that assumption is wrong, couldn't we?
We could do, and that's one of the reasons why the council holds its contingency.
Right, okay. And perhaps the last question I've got at this moment, Chairman. On the capital programme, you have a variety of schemes under natural environment and renewable sources, anaerobic digestion plant and whatever. These are all funding that has been set aside for feasibilities as much as anything else and to build. So I'm guessing that, and correct me if I'm wrong, that within those figures of things like 22.2 and 10.2 and whatever, there's a consultancy cost to actually do the feasibility studies born within that total figure. Do you have any idea how much they are?
The anaerobic digestion, the anaerobic digestion plan is around about 200,000.
So it's about 200,000. Yeah.
Because what was on the example, this outline business case that's still being worked on, costs dependent on a number of factors, not least site location, which has not been determined obviously, and the cost could range between 16 and 20 million. But we've still got work to do around feasibility, bringing that to full business case, proper demonstration of viability, and in the event that it does, then what the council will have done is approved it in principle, set aside the borrowing, which is the other 20 million, and in the event that the whole scheme can afford to repay its borrowing, then the funding is in place for it to go forward.
Right. Okay. All right, that'll do.
Okay, Joe? Well, I put you down, so either I was drawn to you for one way or just, yeah.
Just looking here, Chris, page 11, capital investment proposals. The £1.4 million for the other green transport and environmental schemes. Could you define that for me, please, in a bit more detail? What are these other environmental schemes?
They are in the programme. That was my way of wrapping up smaller schemes into a single...
Because that is still a significant amount of money, isn't it?
It is, but it's made up of things like it's made up of things like greening the city, which is 100,000. It's made up of the Southsea Common and Town Centre litter management, which is in at 50,000. It covers, I think, one-way streets and low traffic neighbourhoods, 100. But every single scheme, every single new start is on the, when you get the council papers, there'll be colour coded.
What do they mean by litter management? What do they mean by litter management?
That means putting out bins that contain both recyclables and non-recyclables.
Right. Are they the same? Sorry, I'm probably too specific, but is this kind of the move towards these multi-purpose bins that carry everything, including dog muck? Yeah. Okay, fantastic. Thank you.
But when you get the capital report, Appendix 2 of the capital report sets out every single one of the new capital investment proposals.
Thank you.
Right, and my colleague to the left here, Scott.
I've lied to you, Chris. I'm sorry. I said I wasn't going to ask anything. Just on the page 12 of the, I think it's page 12 of the pack, but on the slides it's the capital investment and obligations and aspirations. Yeah. It says about football facilities and park drive programme. Could you just talk me through that quickly?
My information might be a bit dated.
Okay. We can compare then.
Okay.
We can compare. You go first.
Okay. You'll probably know that it was something that the council was pursuing, which I think was to provide facilities in two parts of the city, one in a footballing facility in the north and a footballing facility in the south. I think there was potential external funding that would come across for that, for that. But it's still, if you like, in the aspiration of the council, even though it's probably not as developed as we'd like it to be.
Okay, has the council appointed any sort of consultants for this sort of feasibility work that you're aware of?
Don't know.
Okay,
Don't know.
very interesting.
Anyone else got any more questions, members? No. Oh, Councillor Dowling.
Thank you, Chris. Just want to say, very good budget from yourself, senior officers and the administration. Good to see the greenest budget Portsmouth City Council has ever put forward, along with great investment in our city's young people and the most vulnerable, with £6 million additional funding going into children's social care, adult social care and education.
Anyone else?
Councillor Pitt said through Councillor Dowling.
Members? Okay. No more indication to anyone speaking. That in effect wraps up today's meeting. Obviously you'll get more access to budgets in due course.
Next week.
Indeed. 4th of February is the next listed meeting for Cabinet. So if anyone thinks of any questions after today's meeting, I'm sure Chris will be happy to oblige. But thank you for your attendance today, and I'll see you in a week's time or so. Thank you. Oh yeah, I forgot. Happy Brexit Day.